Not long before we went live, we found out that Steve Bannon has been indicted on 2 contempt charges over his lack of willingness to comply with a subpoena from the House investigation of January 6th. One contempt court is related to Mr. Bannon's refusal to appear for a deposition. The other is for his refusal to produce documents for the committee. And I think a lot of people had been wondering if the DOJ would actually do this. It had been recommended by the House, but whether the DOJ would actually act on it was a whole nother question. But this was a statement put out by Merrick Garland, the Attorney General. He said, "Since my first day in office, I have promised Justice Department employees that together we would show the American people by word and deed that the department adheres to the rule of law, follows the facts and the law, and pursues equal justice under the law. Today's charges reflect the department's steadfast commitment to these principles." And we don't know the timeline on this. Trials of this sort could take a year or longer. But as of right now, each count of contempt of Congress carries a minimum of 30 days and a maximum of 1 year in jail, as well as a fine of $100 to $1,000. Not much money, especially for a guy who is quite successful at scamming his followers out of large sums of money. So maybe that won't hurt him too much. He will be apparently turning himself in on Monday. It's cool when you're rich and powerful and you're charged with crimes, you can just say, "I'll be there in a few days, I guess." Maybe he'll have a fun weekend, maybe he'll go to a resort or something, I don't know. But interestingly, also bear in mind, Mark Meadows also didn't show up for his deposition with the House Select Committee. And so could he be facing the same sorts of contempt charges? He's doing the exact same thing. I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, so what does Steve Bannon know about January 6th? Is he a relevant witness? Let's start there. Number one, he was in the so-called war room of Trump supporters in the Willard Hotel in Washington as the attack was unfolding, and they were reacting apparently to beforehand, afterwards. What were they doing? Maybe it's perfectly innocuous. Oh my God, they're rioting. We didn't expect that. Let's try to stop it. If that's the case, okay, great. Then we'll get the documents and then he'll be acquitted, right? Or well, not of the subpoena, but overall in the January 6th investigation, he'll be cleared. He didn't do anything wrong. But if they're talking about, okay, good, let's then have him head to the Capitol, and then if they have to break in, they have to break in. By the way, that sounds, like I'd be surprised if they were that clear and they were that blunt. So that's why I genuinely say I don't know, right? But we do know this. In his podcast the day before, he said on January 6th, quote, "all hell was going to break loose." Okay, so he apparently knew that some sort of hell was gonna break loose. So what kind of hell was it, right? And what did they plan? And he's talking with Trump on the phone. So these are all very relevant questions. Now, can he ignore a lawful subpoena? First of all, let's answer it this way. Can you ignore a lawful subpoena? Hell no is the answer. You would definitely be in prison and you'd be in a world of trouble, okay? Now for him, he says, well, I'm an elite right winger. I'm above the law. I don't have to follow this law that's meant for black people and others, right? And the answer is no, that's not the case. He says, well, I have executive privilege, okay? Well, executive privilege is for people that work in the White House in their communications with the president. But Steve Bannon didn't work in the White House. Steve Bannon hadn't worked in the White House for 3 years. Steve Bannon had been fired by the president. That seems to be a really weak case for executive privilege, okay? He said, well, I talked to Trump and Trump says I should have it. Oh, really, does he? But that's not a thing when a former president can say, hey, I talked to Bob. I think Bob should be privileged for the rest of his life to never share any of our conversations, even if it was about crimes. Me and Bob might have talked about how we were gonna murder someone, which by the way is plausible given what he just said about Mike Pence, right? But I'm not going to tell you that, and Bob is not allowed to tell you that for the rest of his life. That's not a thing. That's not a law. That's not a rule. You just made that up. And soon we're gonna find out in court if they made it up, and you're gonna see that they did. Yeah.
But in Trump's world, Cenk, everything you just said does exist. He believes that he does have that kind of power. And the fact that Bannon was fired for 3 years certainly did not officially work for the White House, but you best believe he is the Trump whisperer extraordinaire. And it is going to be very telling what comes through all of this. So the fact that for the January 6th, commission, this definitely shows that they have some power, and it should send chills up the spines of others who are in waiting.
Yeah. And by the way, there are a number of others who've been subpoenaed. We mentioned Marco Meadows there. We'll have to see what happens with him. Of course, all of them have an incentive to, at the very least, refuse to show up until there are charges. I guess they want to show that they're loyal to Donald Trump. I mean, you heard what we talked about in the first block. If you just willingly abide by the subpoena and provide documents, what's Donald Trump gonna say about you? What are his followers gonna think about you after that? And it makes me think about a video earlier this week of Stephen Miller, who was being interviewed by Laura Ingraham while standing in seemingly a graveyard, oddly enough. And he was asked, will you comply with the subpoena? And twice he just like laughed, mimicking a regular human and saying, I haven't gotten the documents. He wouldn't answer the question. She concluded that he was saying no, but he never actually answered the question. And I wonder now, in hindsight, was he waiting to see if something like this would happen? It's been a few weeks of Steve Bannon not complying. Was he just wondering what would happen? And understand that, of course, they have less legal cover than they did before. I mean, Steve Bannon has already been pardoned for some crimes that were just beginning to be investigated. He was pardoned by Trump after scamming something like $1 million+ out of Trump supporters' pockets for his own personal benefit, to buy a yacht for his buddy and stuff like that. It's weird that that didn't bother the MAGA world, but anyway, he's not gonna get pardoned off of this, not unless they drag this case out for 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a couple of funny things and a couple of important things. Yeah, MAGA world's like, oh, he ripped us off. Yeah, Trump said it's okay to rip us off. Oh yeah. And then we're not supposed to say that you're unintelligent. We're supposed to, oh well, they could be pretty geniuses. They say, oh yeah, here, take my money. Oh, you ripped me off. You got a yacht. Oh yeah, what? Come on, guys, come on. Okay, all right. So now, the most important part here is Bannon is saying, I'm not going to follow the law for 2 reasons. Number one, they genuinely have an entitlement complex. They think equality under the law is a joke. And they think, come on, the law doesn't really apply to us, right? We're privileged. They don't think of it in terms of like consciously have a conversation with one another over tea and crumpets. Oh, I'm privileged, are you privileged? Oh yes, I do declare, right? No, but they just genuinely are surprised. And it goes down like the January 6th rioters. They're like, what? Well, I was just breaking and entering. What's the big deal? I just smashed a bunch of things and hit a bunch of cops. But what? What? I'm allowed to go in there and do that and take over my government, aren't I?
One of the good ones.
Yeah, and by the way, they do shootings and they go, what? Second Amendment rights, what? Like, because they've been told Second Amendment rights is you're allowed to kill anyone you like. Or you call it self-defense or stand your ground. And so but the second part's even scarier. They're testing the boundary of the law to see if anyone's going to stop them. In fact, this is amazing. Steve Bannon, right before he was indicted, was on the air saying this. I'm gonna give you this quote, okay? First, there's a funny part. He says, and we're gonna get to the bottom of 3 November. What is 3 November? That's not a thing, okay? November 3rd is a thing. The 3rd of November is kind of a thing. 3 November is not a thing. Anyway, we're gonna get to the bottom of 3 November and we're gonna decertify the electors, okay? And you're gonna have a constitutional crisis. But you know what? We're a big and tough country and we can handle that. We'll be able to handle that. We'll get through that. He's saying we are going to create a constitutional crisis by brazenly breaking the law repeatedly and doing something totally outrageous, which is to try to reverse a presidential election a year later. It is totally like it's not even close to the Constitution. It's not on the same planet as the United States Constitution. And he knows that that's why he says we're gonna do a constitutional crisis by doing something that is not in the Constitution. And then we're gonna see if they have the nerve to stop us. And if they don't stop us, that's it. We just did a coup. And that means we could just use violence and force and just ignore the law when it comes to us. He said that right before he got indicted. He didn't even know that he had been indicted. And when asked, and he always said in the paragraph before about a critique of this law breaking, he said, quote, suck on this, okay? So now the question, and it is a very, very important, it's a critical question. Do we have rule of law in this country? If we are weak and we say to fascists, no, you can break any law you like and you could tear up our Constitution and do a violent coup against our democracy, the fascists will definitely win. You think it can't happen here? That's what they thought in Germany. That's what they thought in Italy. That's what they thought everywhere where fascism won. It can definitely happen here. Right. We must draw the line. And the line is really simple. What's the law today? Enforce the goddamn law.
Yeah.
That's it. We're screwed if they don't do this. He must be made an example of. He is not above the law. Mr. Trump is not above the law. None of his minions are above the law. These people are not above the law, and they must be brought to justice for this behavior.
Yeah. Related news, by the way, the individual who brought more than a dozen Molotov cocktails to the Capitol on January 6th pleaded guilty earlier today. Just normal tourist stuff. Just bring in some Molotov cocktails.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. We really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.